For the digital coloring assignment, we're going to look at importing a drawing that you've made offline. You can also use a drawing that you've made digitally as well and just color something that you've fully rendered in Photoshop or Procreate or GIMP. Essentially what you're doing is adding a layer of digital color on top of something that you've scanned in. And that should be fully separate in a fully separate layer down here. So let's start with the raw material and have a go. When you scan in your drawing, sometimes it will be helpful to amplify the color, I guess. So if you increase the contrast, that can just really sharpen up the image and help you start modifying your drawing. So if you go to the level contrast and just take that, see how there's no data right here? We want to take that black slider and move it a little bit so we're not overlapping this white area, but we're just kind of coming up to it. And that increases the contrast, the intensity of the black, just a bit. From there, we want to always preserve your original pen drawing or your pencil or whatever sketch you've done. So you want to duplicate your background layer. That can be done by just dragging your layer to the new layer icon down here, or you can just copy, paste, select, use your selection tool, select your drawing, and Command C, Command V to create a new layer. However you choose to do it, you want to make sure that one is labeled the original. And then one will be your modifying layer. It's always good, like I said, just to have that record so you can always come back to what you started with and make adjustments. To make the colorful layer, you always want to label. Keep track of your layers by adding just small labels. So ink, color, that will take care of that. Lock your original in place so you don't mess with it. And so whatever color you add, it's going to be on a separate layer above this drawing. That way you have a more flexibility to interact, adjust how it interacts with those other layers, whether you want it to be a little bit lighter, more transparent. That it just gives you that extra flexibility by working in layers. To select your area, if you start painting, you can literally just start painting some type of color and start filling in your image as you wish. But that can be a little bit tricky because then you have to deal with staying inside the lines, and it, you know, whatever you can do to help that process go a little bit more smoothly is useful. So what we want to do is mask off this area to basically create an outline of just where you want color, and then you can scribble all over it and be a little bit more judicious. So masking essentially creates an area out of which you cannot color. So that bounding line will keep everything contained. It's like a cheat for how to stay within the lines when you want to. Back in here. Stop. Sorry. Don't drag your hand across the tablet. So we can do that. We can start setting that up with one way to create kind of a pseudo mask, or at least start the masking process, is to use your lasso tool. The lasso tool, if you click and drag, you're creating a custom shape based on where you're going. So there's a couple ways you can approach creating your color mask or your color layer. But both involve selecting the area that you want to be filled with color. And by selecting, you can use your quick selection tool, or your magic wand tool, by selecting the outside of your drawing. And what that will do, by selecting the white space around your drawing, it will get everything that is not a certain color, and turning down your tolerance. If you're finding that you're getting a lot of extra material included that you don't want necessarily, oops. If you're finding that you're getting a lot of extra material within your drawing that you don't actually want to select in your process, turn down your tolerance to something low, like a 10 or a 20, depending on the size of your drawing, depending on the resolution of your drawing. So that gives us a little bit more of your actual thing that you want highlighted. Let's turn it down some more. And that's pretty close. We're missing this section. We can add it back in. You can also go around and use your lasso tool to just physically highlight and depict, like pick out what exactly you want to be included in your color block. So if I wanted just to color this leg, I would select just that leg, and now you can start coloring it. Well, not on there, on your separate color layer. And that is something that is perfectly fine to do. Just use your lasso tool, select, color on a different layer. The magic wand tool and messing around with those settings can make your job easier. It can make your job harder as well, because if you look, let's add this section back in. So remember, adding with the lasso tool, if you select, you create a selection and you wanted a little bit more to add on, holding shift will let you add other sections. And holding option, will let you delete sections. So you can modify your selection process that way. If we zoom in a little bit, once we have our selection made, you can modify, select, modify, expand to make that a little bit bigger, or contract. And that will be useful when we're using that magic wand tool. So we have our magic wand. Notice that it's catching a tiny bit of that paper haze around the mark making that you have. So this is a case where we would want to contract a little bit, just to narrow in on, so we're not coloring outside of the lines, essentially. So here's that little missing section. Add that back in. And when I say add back in, I'm actually subtracting it now, because I had selected, we are doing an inverse selection. We're selecting the white area around the drawing. And now we want to flip that. If we select the white area around the drawing, that's just an easier way to get the whole thing at once, rather than select all of these little pixels individually. And again, it's just a matter of how precise do you want or need to be for this particular use. For what we are doing, where we're coloring in, we don't necessarily need to have all of the little CD selected. Because those are just going to be black anyway. So as you're doing your lasso, if you're doing a manual selection where you're just literally tracing around your outline, you don't have to include all those little structures. If you are cutting out this drawing, so this is all selected now, if I copy and paste that to a new layer. So if you're just coloring it, you don't necessarily need to include all the little CD, because they're going to be black anyway. if this was a case where you were cutting out this drawing to put on a different color surface or to extract for use elsewhere, you would want to make sure that those are included in your selection so that you don't leave them behind. And the Magic Wand tool can help facilitate that by taking some of your work out of the context. When you are selecting, if you do that Magic Wand selection of the outside, the negative space of your drawing, you have to remember to inverse it. So Magic Wand, select the outside, inverse it. So now, if we don't inverse it, if we start coloring, the only thing that's going to show up if we don't inverse it, the only thing that's going to show up, that's going to be able to modify, is this white space. We have selected all of the white space. So to inverse it, select inverse, get onto your new color layer, and now you're working within that. This also, turn it down. There we go. Notice that it will also pick up, by selecting that inverse, we are picking up a little bit of the speckles and little imperfections of the paper as well, and those will be picked up and colored with that Magic Wand tool. If you're just using your lasso tool to select your area, none of this will be affected or be picked up. With the color, if you want to see the drawing underneath, there are two ways you can do that. You can adjust the opacity and make that color a little more transparent to see underneath, see through it. That can be effective in some ways. It will also affect the quality of the line that you see. So notice as you become more opaque, those lines are starting to disappear. They're starting to be hidden behind the color itself. Or you can change the settings of that layer itself. So in this particular layer, the most common setting that you will use when you're doing coloring of an existing drawing is multiply. And what that does is the color maintains its intensity, but it's multiplying the underlying layers. So it detects that there is ink, there is darkness underneath, and it allows it to show through at the same intensity. So that's very useful. One thing that is good to do is create swatches. So say I like this orange, oops, let's make that 100% opaque. You can adjust your layer opacity, you can adjust your brush opacity. So brush stuff will be up at the top, layer stuff will be over in your layer panel. Let's get rid of that. So to always have something to come back to as you're picking your colors, you find something that works really well for your insect. So, this is it. That's my favorite one. And you want to keep a record of that so you don't have to re-find that color every time you need to go back to it if you do need to go back. You can always delete your little swatch panel later, but it's nice to have it on your color layer just as reference. Okay. That way, if you have a few main colors that are working well for you, again, you don't have to go back and find, okay, where was that color? Where did I put it? And get close enough. You can just go to your color picker by clicking on your color area, move your mouse off of that panel, and find your swatch. So no matter where you are in the color spectrum, if you use your eyedropper and take a sample of that swatch, you found it again. If it's something that you want to come back to and keep modifying and work a little more intensely with, it's useful to set up a mask. Again, this is not necessary for this project if you do not wish it, but it is a useful technique. Masking, if you click on it, will highlight an area that is to be protected. And in this case, since we have selected the color area, we want to reverse that. We want all of the mask shows up as pink. You want the reverse, you want everything outside of your drawing to be that pink color, to be masked. Let me show you what that means. So we'll ignore our color groups for a second, and let's see. Let's inverse. Okay. So creating a mask, we'll go back to our regular ink, get our selection, the lasso, get that little missing chunk. Yep. That little missing chunk included there. So we have gone back to selecting everything outside of our drawing. And again, all of these speckles, this can be part of why it's useful to set up a mask and take a little more time at the outset to get that a little more well defined and sort of take care of some of those issues, so you don't have little specks showing up in your future work and your coloring down the road. So it's just like a little more fussy. Selecting with your lasso tool directly will avoid any of this extra crumbs that are hanging around the edges when you do something automated like the magic wand tool. So it is kind of worth your time to go through and either get rid of those, what have you. You can spend as much time as you want modifying this kind of thing. And notice that we have this little haze here. We want to modify that. We don't want that included as part of our mask, because then we'll permanently be coloring outside of the lines. We want that to be as closely aligned with our intended outline as possible. So with our selection tool, we want to select, modify your selection, and contract it. Expand it. Depending on, are you selecting the negative space? Then you want to contract it. Or if you are selecting the negative space, you want to expand it to push those borders closer to your drawing. If you have lasso selected your space and you want it to be a little bit bigger, you can expand it. Okay, so you want to modify, expand, 2 pixels. Let's see what that looks like. Now it's a little closer to the border that we actually want. And that seems pretty good. Maybe 1 more pixel. Select, modify, expand by 1 pixel. And that looks pretty good. You can continue making adjustments as needed. 1 more. Select, modify, expand. There we go, because we want to be just inside that border so we don't have color leaking out the edges. If this was something where you wanted to select the inverse, so now we have selected our insect. If you wanted to just copy and paste, what that will do is select everything that you have within that selection. It will take it and extract it, and notice how fine it was around those lines. If you do take that time, this is now a really well cut out thing that you can use and position without worrying about having a little hazy white outline that's getting in the way of things. So let's just undo that. Go back to our selection. And from there, now we are creating our mask. We have a nice, precisely selected object. And if we turn on the mask, everything that is pink will be protected. Notice there's a little bit between those antennae. Let's put that back in there. Lasso tool, add it to that white space. Oops. There we go. Let's check our mask, pop that on and see, okay, are there any areas where you still see, here we go, we have a little sneaky, sneaky subject here. The masking itself is very time consuming, but it really by doing all this work ahead of time and getting your preparations all precisely set up, you will save yourself time on the back end when you're doing your actual coloring. So let's go with this. Pop on that mask, you can see, look, this now, all this area that is not pink is what we are going to be coloring. So once you've checked your mask, uncheck it so we still see those dancing ants, we still see that outline of your mask, and then click create a new layer, your new mask color layer, and then click the mask symbol that is down underneath the layer panel. So you have a mask symbol here to toggle on and off your mask. You have a mask symbol here to create the mask. This is what you're actually going to be using to make that hidden layer. And by clicking on it, on this new layer, it makes this mask right here. You can see that outline of the larva. And you want to make sure that see how this is selected, the mask is selected. You can continue to modify the mask itself by painting on white or black when you are selected in this area. Once you've made the mask and you're done with it, and that's fine, make sure that you are selecting this column here that has that sort of boxy, transparent look. By painting in here, this is what is now the open area for your work. Set up your color swatch. Your color swatches actually won't set up here because this is masked. If you do want to set up those color swatches, that can be very helpful. You will just have to do that on another layer. So you would create another color swatch layer. So like these were the options where we just selected. This is the option where we're masking. So to set up our color swatch layer, you get your spot of color here and your spot of color here. And then in your mask, over on the left-hand side, now when you start painting your little fella, it's right in there. That's great. You can also fill. So G will give you the paint bucket and will fill, create this nice silhouette. And from there, then you can multiply that layer. And that's what you're working in. Whatever you paint now will be within this mask. You can always come back to it, and it's just kind of a great way to make things a little easier. Let's get our color swatches. For this assignment, I would like you to use at least 2 or 3 colors as you're modifying your structures. Sometimes if your color is too intense, you can modify the color itself or modify the brush. So we were talking about modifying opacity over in your layer, the whole layer opacity. You can also modify up at the top. This is your brush menu. You can make that a little bit less intense so that you can control the flow and how much color you're actually adding. And say, I want that whole first part of this little dude, plus extra little swatches here and there. The intensity of what you the size of your brush and the hardness of your brush. So if you set up for pressure sensitivity on your pad, the harder you press, the larger the brush will be. Or you can associate it with pressure. The harder you press, the softer and more diffuse your color will be. There's a wide variety of approaches you can have here. But when you're looking at the size of your brush, if you have a very large brush, let's zoom in here, that edge will be more diffuse than if that same brush with that same hardness is a smaller size. So lower pressure, lower size, harder pressure, larger size, but you can also physically modify the size of your brush by toggling your bracket back and forth. And, continue to build up layers and add adjustments from there. Just to augment what you've already done with your, either if you've imported a traditional drawing or the drawing that you've done digitally. And that should pretty much get you set up for modifying your work. Let's get a little tail end back here. You can have as many different layer colors. You can actually separate these colors out into separate structures, separate layers if you so wish. There's a lot of different approaches that you can take to adding coloring to your drawing. One thing that I do recommend is if you are working on the same layer, you can smudge things around. Make that smudge a little bigger, make that smudge a little stronger. Strength up here. And so now you're physically mixing and moving the colors in that layer itself. That's something that you can just make those kind of micro adjustments as needed. Sometimes it takes your computer brain a little while to catch up. But one thing that I do recommend is if you're going to add highlights, white highlights or something, have a separate layer. So let's disappear our color swatches and add a highlight layer. The reason that you would add a highlight layer is so you can increase or decrease the intensity as needed. So maybe we want this guy to be a little bit shinier. So let's make our brush a little bit smaller and just paint on a more opaque. There we go. Paint on little areas of highlight. The eye, little spaces where light would be shining off of a hardened exoskeleton. It's catching the light. But maybe that's a little too intense. Maybe you wanted that to be more subtle, because that gets really bold. Though that can work well if you're going for a really graphic, bold style. So from there, you can adjust that highlight separate from your colors, and I think that's really valuable. So if you wanted to tone it down a bit, now you have that flexibility with just the highlights without manipulating your entire underlying color structure. If the underlying drawing, if this ink drawing is a little bold for you and you want to tone it down, again, keep your original, but you can look at your actual ink drawing and make either the color of that ink itself slightly different. Okay, so using your adjustment layer of the ink itself, let's just look at that right there. The color balance can be modified to be a little more green, a little more yellow, something that where it will blend into the background a bit more. You can try that out and see if that looks different. So no, it's making it a little bit more subtle, a little bit more integrated with your color, if you so choose, and to any degree, however much you want it to blend. So yeah, options. There's a lot of options here. And you can spend as much time as you want on shading and shadowing and blending and adding different, like maybe you want a little more red color. there's untold amounts of play that you can do. So those are the main things. The main things that we're using here is that multiply layer and the multiply setting of your color layer, masking if you so choose. If you don't choose to use the mask, if that's not really in your interest, you can just, again, select. You just physically select the area you want to color and then color within that. It just makes things a little bit easier to have that bounding box where, whether it's a selected bounding box or a mask bounding box that can. With that, please let me know if you have any questions and have fun painting.